Hello
Hello, and
and
welcome to
welcome
another
to
episode.
Alice. Stop. Crossover episode. You've agreed to be my interviewee today.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
But I'll
Your
let
turn.
you acknowledge the people behind the scenes. So Traces.Dreams.
Traces.Dreams is Narina Fanato and her extraordinary editing and producing team. And we're very grateful to have them on board for this project. These projects, I guess.
Yeah. And your Inequalities channel is going so great. So many fantastic interviews, so many interesting perspectives that you're bringing to the table.
The people I interview bring to the table, I guess. I mean, it's great because of the content that they are happy to share with me and with the audience. So I'm very grateful to them, especially.
And Inequalities is your specialty area.
Yes, if you can call it an area, I guess, then yes. I mean, it's a very diverse and very all-encompassing area, if you will. But yes, it's my main academic specialty.
So it's kind of for that reason that I wanted to ask you to be an interviewee, because asking the question, what is normal in relation to your expertise, will be really interesting. So I'm just going to jump in on our special crossover episode with the question to start our discussion. Alice, what is normal?
I'm not sure you're asking the right person about that. I'm not sure I have a lot of experience with normal, on a personal level. But I guess I'll start as an academic. And what I guess is normal for an academic is to explain the concept and to say that I think there's like two specific features of the concept of normal or normality. And one relates to something that is kind of a standard. We measure something in terms of a specific standard, and we might use an average or something to create a norm that we can expect from whatever it is, distribution of something, a person, a rule, something. We need this kind of norm in order to have kind of, say, my agreeable day-to-day experience of life, else things would just be crazy. I mean, if we didn't have norms for, let's say, traffic, for example, probably it would be very difficult to coordinate a semi-smooth daily life. The other feature of normal is that it depends very much on when you ask the question and where you ask the question. So normal is not like a universal thing, right? It depends on the time and it depends on the place. There are different normalities or different features, I guess, that are considered normal. So what is normal today here in Mexico is probably not normal, considering that you're already living in the future tomorrow in Australia. So there's definitely a component of contextuality to that. And then there's another feature, which is probably the one that maybe accommodates me most, or that makes me most wary of the idea of normality, is that it has this dark dystopian side of norming people, right? Or of something almost dictatorial, where it plays into expectations that we have about behavior of people. And that could be that we want people to appear physically in a certain way, or that we want to have specific reactions that we expect. And again, this can be totally healthy, let's say, because we need to expect something, or we need to create shortcuts in our minds to be able to have normal social interaction, right? So we don't start from tabula rasa every time we meet somebody, but it can turn into stereotypes that are very dangerous, right? That when we expect people all to, I don't know, be the same, or have a certain feature that some people might not have or not want to have. So there's like a whole big blah about what could be normal, and then probably I'll like to be everything else.
So first of all, when we talk about normality, we're talking about norms and standards, rules that we abide by in order to interact in society. Secondly, we need to think about context. So we need to think about the context in which these standards and expectations make sense. And thirdly, the dimension of normativity. So the way in which people are governed and ruled by standards of normality that are sometimes imposed upon them. But I think from my perspective, I would also suggest that they are standards that we are also assume upon ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'd say if I had been as eloquent and fast thinking as you were now repeating what I said in half the words, I would have said exactly that. So
Oh no,
great.
I'm just
Thank you.
paraphrasing. It helps to have that explanation. It helps to have that description. And and a very eloquent answer. Thank you. I guess when I watch your channel and I think about the question I ask my interviewees, I sometimes think, oh wow, I wonder if we have normalized inequality. I wonder if inequality has become normal. How do you feel about that?
I think that the answer is a hesitant, definite yes. And that is because if we hadn't normalized the degree of inequality, we would probably not be able to bear it. It's when you get deeper into it, it's really quite frustrating and hurtful to imagine conditions so different for people that supposedly should be equal, right? As human creatures. So I guess we need some degree of normalization or even naturalization in order to be able to cope with it on a daily basis, to cope with problems like poverty or like crime or like danger or all kinds of scary things. And then on a more concrete level, I think there is a definite normalization and also naturalization going on with some dimensions of inequality, probably more than others. And one that I can think of very concretely is racism. So, for example, in the context that I live in Mexico, there is a very large degree of racism going on, but it's more subtle maybe than in many other places. Not always, sometimes it's also very non-subtle, but a lot of it is very low-key. And it's like comments on a daily basis. It's behavioral patterns that are trained and socialized from very early age. And that mean that many people don't realize that these norms or these, norms, there you go, are racist, or the way of interaction that people display are not fair. But because they're so normalized and even naturalized, people tend to think that that's just how the world is and always will be and kind of has to be, right? It's also there's a normative aspect to it, which is also very scary when we look at things like racism, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one with respect to, it could be sexism, could be racism, could be a few of these places where even the people who are in the unequal part of that relationship sometimes accept that and
Yeah.
normalize it for themselves, as much as the richer parties or the more empowered parties or the more entitled, privileged parties have normalized it for themselves. What I find interesting in my own travels, and I'm an anthropologist, so I've done fieldwork in a few different countries, and one thing I find interesting is sometimes those inequalities are very visible in some countries, and in other countries like Australia, it's quite invisible. It's out of sight for a large proportion of people. And it's out of sight for the people perhaps best positioned to address it, which is difficult because once they have normalized their standards of living, which are contingent upon other people not having those standards of living, it normalizes a very unequal relationship between different groups of people, not easily bifurcated by gender or race alone, but the intersection of race, the intersection of age, the intersection of your visa, your passport, where you were born, the languages you speak, so many different factors, the education you've had as well.
Yeah, I guess one of the problems there is that usually when you think that there is no discrimination or no inequality going on, then that's because you're in the privileged position. And what privilege does is that it creates a blind spot, right? So it creates kind of a norm, a basis that me in the privileged position think is normal and is how everything works. So if I'm not confronted with this because I'm discriminated, I expect everybody to have the same experience, kind of. And there are some cognitive features that define this. I mean, human beings have a tendency to create references in their environment and to have biases of availability, etc. Right? So we can go into that whole discussion of how the brain is built. But I mean, beyond that, it's a fact that privilege makes you kind of blind to the non-norm, right? So when you normalize this privileged position, as you say, for example, in Australia, when you don't have, or in many other places where you don't have these blatant or the visible inequalities, because they might be blatant, but they're just not as visible, probably because there's not as much visible of the extremes, right? You don't have so much visible poverty and so much visible wealth right next to each other, and then you don't see the whole spectrum, and then you normalize your own position. Yeah, which is dangerous, as you say, when it's about people that are kind of in the position to change things and they don't feel that there is a problem, then things continue the same way as they are.
I like this metaphor of the blind spot that you bring up, because it's one of the reasons I love asking this question, what is normal? Because if you really take that question seriously, it can help you expose your blind spots. It can help expose the unintended consequences of the system that you have set up and perpetuated and contributed to. And if we can ask somewhat basic questions, but really interrogate them seriously, hopefully we can address those blind spots. What can we do to address this? What can we do to address the inequalities that we have taken to be normal?
Well, asking ourselves about the blind spot, I guess, is one of the first steps, or is one step. I don't know whether there's a sequence to it. Definitely, we need to have a lot more information about these things. We need to question them, for ourselves and in the larger context. I am a believer in that awareness creates a need to act. I'm not sure whether that's an illusion. Maybe it is, but anyways, I need to believe in something positive, researching all these unequal relationships. And then I think that there also needs to be some specific action, for example, by the government towards equalizing at least opportunities for people, because that's impossible to just happen spontaneously after centuries of discrimination or discriminative behavior or disprivilege or some groups or persons in advantageous positions compared to others. So these differences, they don't disappear just because we become aware of them. So we do need some state action, let's say, to address them.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, we need to expose them to the people who can do something about it.
To all people, both to
Yeah.
those that can do something about it, and also, as you said before, to those that internalize these unnormalities, well, these normalities that are not healthy normalities.
Yeah. So expose it to not just the people in power, but to everyone involved, and then to help people understand it, and then to take action on it. It might be a radical position, but I really am becoming much more sympathetic to the idea that we need to dismantle some of these systems that perpetuate inequality. And I take that a step further because I work at a zoo. And in my current job, I think about multi-species inequality and multi-species reciprocity and multi-species prosperity. And we can see that the inequalities that we observe in social circles are having a huge impact upon the rest of nature as well. And I really feel very strongly that if we can start to address the inequalities in human populations, then hopefully we can start to address the unequal relationships that we have on the rest of nature, and recognize the obstacle that human populations are posing to the rest of nature, and the hurdle, and sort of removing ourselves as a hurdle to the prosperity of biodiversity and the planetary ecosystem. Have you taken your thinking about inequality further than human inequality?
Yeah, I think if what you say is a radical proposition, I guess then, let's be radical. That's kind of necessary, I'd say. I remember very concretely a situation about 10, 15 years ago when I started my new job in Guatemala, and I had a computer installed and my colleague had to put down the mouse, and I said, could you change the side of the mouse? I need it on the other side. And he said, you're a female economist, vegetarian and left-handed. Is there anything else I need to know? It was this "and" that I remember very particularly, is like all these abnormal things that come together. And also you need to have the mouse on the left side because you write with your other hand, and that's just weird. But so, I mean, I remember that because it was kind of an encounter with this extreme expectation of norm, which in the eyes of my then colleague who kindly helped me install the computer, basically just cut off all his expectations and threw him off completely. Well, one of these features that he found absurdly abnormal was this idea that I was a vegetarian. And I think that's definitely not something very radical. And it's probably even less radical now than it was 15 years ago in Guatemala. But it's definitely something that is not a particularly big step to take for most human beings, and could be a wonderful approach towards what you say would be like an interspecies or universal equality, I guess, or at least improvement.
It sounds like having the mouse on the opposite side was the icing on the cake.
Yeah, it absolutely was. It was.
Not only do you not eat meat, but you also have to have your mouse on the left-hand side of your computer.
Exactly.
I like that you brought up ethical food, and because and here I'm making an assumption it might not be an ethical choice for you, but is it an ethical choice to turn to being a vegetarian?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I mean, there's different reasons for it, right? But originally, when I started as an 8 or 9-year-old, and I saw some animal transports, and I just felt bad about it, and I realized I didn't like animals, so I didn't want to eat them, and I wanted to have them, further away. And then eventually, it became the argument of the environmental sustainability became a lot more important when I became conscious about these issues.
Yeah.
Which I probably wasn't at the age.
There's a lot of different pathways that people can travel to become vegetarian. One is sympathy for non-human animals, and the other one is recognition that meat consumption consumes a lot of water, requires a lot of energy, and also releases a lot of carbon emissions. So there's so many pathways to becoming a vegetarian. I've actually been playing with this idea of what's an ethical diet. Yes. I've started eating insects in my diet, replacing meat and other forms of protein with cricket powder, and that's the most accessible insect to eat. It's available now in supermarkets in Australia.
How is that going?
It's interesting because for me it's I'm exploring if this is an ethical option, because on one level it's not vegetarian, because you are killing an animal. It's an invertebrate, so there might be some leeway there for some flexitarians. But in terms of the production and the energy that goes into making crickets, they use much less water, much less space is used. And what's really interesting about eating a cricket, this is the thing I find really interesting, is you're not just eating one part of the animal. You're not just cutting off different muscles and then possibly wasting some of the other parts of the animal or sending it to pet food. You're eating the whole cricket.
You do know that in Mexico that's pretty normal, eating crickets and ants.
Yeah. I think 2 billion, 3 billion people worldwide eat insects in their diet. How do they eat crickets in Mexico?
Roasted with chili and salt.
Yum, just like chips.
Mm-hmm.
And everyday snack.
You can buy them on the market. Yeah, you buy them on the market in a paper cone, and then you can just eat them like this, and you put some chili sauce on them.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and
crunch.
Well, Mexican chili sauce, I love it too. I'm very much a chili fan. Yeah, so it's interesting though, because and this harks back to the context question, because in Mexico that's a very common food. In Australia,
a normal thing.
Yeah, in one context it's been normalized, in another context it hasn't been normalized. And it reminds me of being vegetarian. In India, it's vegetarian is the option that's given in the first instance, and you have to specify if you are non-vegetarian, which I love the fact that it's not a choice to not eat meat, it's a choice to eat meat. And so it's definitely, we normalize different standards according to context, and it's a good reminder of those things. But for people who haven't eaten insects, it's really funny to see that the standards we have normalized are not just cognitive, conceptual standards, they are visceral. They are in the bodies of people who have assumed them and internalized them to the point that some people will dry retch thinking about eating an insect. Like it's so offensive, for example, to have an insect in your meal, in a salad or something, that you would send it back to the waiter and throw it in the chef's face. But now when I'm looking at a plate and I see an insect on it, I just see some extra protein. It's changed my relationship to animals around me, and it's funny because I we get a lot of cockroaches in Sydney, and this is just a common problem, and it has really highlighted how much pesticide use we use every day in big cities. It has also highlighted to me our visceral reaction to these pests, but they are pests because we created that problem. The way in which we live spandrels where insects like cockroaches can thrive. And it's really interesting that we have created a system that denies the prosperity of certain species, but allows the pest species to thrive. And in many ways, we have created our own pests. And you would think that because I'm eating insects now, that I would have a relationship with insects where I still hate them or something, but I don't. I saw a cockroach the other day, and rather than stomping on him or
How
spraying
would it
him,
taste?
I just picked him up and put him outside. And it's funny because it didn't make me less empathic towards this other species because I consume his cousins or her cousins. It's actually made me more empathic to these insects that are living alongside us all the time, and sadly, in many countries around the world, actually dwindling in numbers in quite dramatic ways. I remember driving so between Melbourne and Sydney, it's about more than 1,000 kilometres, depending on where in Sydney you live, and where in Melbourne you're going to, or vice versa. And 15 years ago, you drove a car from Melbourne to Sydney, and you would have to wash the front car, it would just be littered with insects. And this year, when I've been doing that drive, I just so there are fewer insects on my car today when I make that drive between Melbourne and Sydney than there were 15 years ago. And just in my lifetime, to see that difference anecdotally, and know that that anecdotal experience marries with what the scientists are finding in their ecological surveys is quite frightening. And so I think there's a few maneuvers here about eating insects that are interesting. The more we invest in eating insects, the more we will invest in researching them. And the more we invest in researching them, the more we will invest in cultivating, hopefully, biodiversity.
Well, it's not exactly what we see with other animals, right? I mean, yeah, we cultivate more pigs, but we're not particularly more empathetic with pigs because we eat them. And we do have that strange relationship with dogs where we can just not imagine eating them, and pigs and cows, and it's kind of, yeah. I mean, I say I don't eat them, so I don't know. That's what I've been told.
It's
I wouldn't
true.
like to eat either of those, but that's also standards or norms that we assume, and I guess it has something to do with the detachment. And maybe I'm assuming, but maybe your relationship with insects is changing because they are closer to you now, and you observe the whole thing, and the process is much more comprehensible for you, from the
Mm.
insect to your food. And I mean, with cows and pigs, we just get a little, or people that eat them get a little piece of whatever the animal was on their plate, and there's no way you can connect it with the actual animal.
To the point that some children in primary school sometimes don't realize that meat comes from a cow, or this, or don't even know which animal their bacon comes from. Or I mean, I find that even it demonstrates in some ways how we can normalize certain standards of living that put the burden of production on other people. And I think the way that labor is distributed in society and puts death and destruction behind closed doors. We don't want the normal citizens to recognize the harsh environments that are created for these other animals in order to produce things like milk, in order to produce things like meat. And I mean, in a country like Australia, it is quite strange to think about eating cattle and sheep and other very European animals, because for 60,000 to 80,000 years, the main source of meat was kangaroos. And kangaroos still outnumber not only domesticated European animals in Australia, but they also outnumber humans across Australia. The four biggest species of kangaroo, I think there's 57 million or more of them across the continent.
Oh, that was my prejudice about Australia not knowing anything, but I didn't know it was actually true. Amazing.
So it's kind of funny that we've normalized eating European foods as opposed to eating the meat which thrives on the continent, and a meat which is actually really healthy because it's really low in fat, important nutrients. It's interesting to make these comparisons because, and this is kind of why I'm playing with my diet, is because I want to play with my sense of normality. I want to see what happens when you juggle around your sense of normality, where you confront the uncomfortable edges of what you would consider your normal lifestyle, particularly in 2020, because we're talking about the next normal. We're talking about the new normal. And I sort of see reason to pause and reflect. And part of the reason I'm eager to ask people what is normal, specialists from different fields, because if we couldn't get normal right before, what makes you think we're going to get normal right again? Or in the future? Because normal is what got us here. Normal is what got us the biggest fires in the United States, Brazil, and Australia that the world has ever recorded. It's given us, arguably it's given us coronavirus because of the way in which urban settlements have expanded, human populations have thrived, and animals and humans have come together because of deforestation in much more close proximity and unhealthy close proximity to create the rise of zoonotic disease. And unless we address the system, those problems, which are the result of the flux of anormality, will continue to result.
I'm completely with you on that one, and it reminds me of another feature that I didn't mention so explicitly when I defined my definition. I gave my definition of normality. I think it's important to ask the question of normal for whom, right? Because as you say, normal was before, and we didn't get it right, and we will probably not get it right in the near future neither. Well, what makes us think that there was anything normal, generally normal before? I mean, there was a situation probably that was considered normal for some people, and that was probably more or less comfortable for some, and probably a lot less comfortable for many others. And they would probably not want to return to that situation, but they would also not like to be in the situation that they're stuck in now, which is even more uncomfortable. And I mean, something that we see a lot in the research of inequalities in general, and specifically economic inequalities, is that they become a lot worse in times of crisis, which are generally kind of the antagonism of normal, right? But even before that, many people lived in constant crisis, and it was, or in many animals, of course, in general, and plants, and the whole system lives in alert in a lot of situations and contexts, right? So it's not something that we can return to, or that we can, in hindsight, consider a generalized normality. Just 2019 was totally normal, and then 2020 wasn't, and 2021 is not gonna, or is gonna be a different normal again. I mean, it's like a process, right? It changes continuously, and it's also different for different people. And I guess that intrinsically then it considers a question of power, right? And that is probably also what makes it very uncomfortable to consider that those that define what is normal are those that have the power to define it over or above others that do not have that position.
You're making me think that a lot of conflict is the result of people saying, my ideas of normality are more important than your ideas of normality. I value my sense of normality over your sense of normality. And you'll often hear the rhetoric of, a lot of wars are put in are under the name of God. But I actually think many wars, you're making me think, and I'm going on a tangent from what you said, but you're making me think that a lot of conflict is the result of people valuing their sense of normality over someone else's sense of normality, and not willing to sit in the discomfort of what happens when two senses of normality interact, and not just collide, but intermesh and become syncretic and creolize and hybridize.
And create the new normal.
Oh gosh, no, please no.
No, no, that's sorry, sorry. I'll take that back. No, but I completely agree with you. I think that's a good way of seeing it.
What questions do you think we should ask about normality?
I guess it's kind of summarizing the questions that or the topics that we've mentioned along this conversation. Something like normal for whom, and normal when, normal where, and also normal, is that desirable? Do we have a desire to create a standard when it comes to human beings, right? So when we talk about standard for measuring distance, we could say, okay, it would be desirable to have a normal, and of course it would be desirable that would be meters and not miles and all kind of other weird things. That's my normal. But it's probably not necessarily intrinsically desirable when we talk about human beings. And as you say, a lot of conflict comes from that, but also a lot of norming in the sense of oppression, right? Or of limitation of what people could be and their potential and their flourishing. And it limits probably a lot of positive things as well, also some negative things. We don't have to be overly pessimistic about the concept of normality, but definitely a lot of positive things. And this idea of putting people in boxes and then they're all squared, and it's not something particularly comforting. So I guess yeah, we should question if we want to have something normal, if that's a good thing or not.
I like that question. Is normal desirable, and is it desirable for whom? I think that's such an important question, especially when we've got world leaders across the globe trying to impose their sense of normality, not just on their own populations, but on other populations to fuel and produce for their sense of normality, whether it's their sense of normal consumption, their sense of normal lifestyle. And I think that's a really great question. Is normal desirable, and is normal desirable for whom? Alice, I've had such a great time chatting with you. Thank you for your
So did I.
time.
Well,
And
thank you.
what a fun little crossover episode.
Yeah,
And we
next
should
time it's your
acknowledge
turn.
Traces.Dreams, Future Framed TV, and Narina Finetto and her whole entire team who help her put this into production, because it's so much fun doing these interviews.
Absolutely, and also acknowledge you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, it's our show, I think. I don't know what we'll have to call it, but
Okay.
we'll figure it out.